Asterisk, a late-night grocery run turned into a nightmare when a rookie cop pointed his gun at an elderly black man, convinced he caught a dangerous suspect. But the truth? That man wasn't just innocent. He was a sitting Supreme Court judge. What happened next left the entire nation speechless. Stay with us, because this story will change the way you see justice, forgiveness, and the power of calm. Asterisk, welcome to BrainFuel, where real stories ignite powerful lessons. If you believe the world needs more empathy, more justice, and more hope, hit subscribe now, because stories like this deserve to be heard. Asterisk, get your hands up, old man. The sudden roar shattered the stillness of the late-night street. The words, sharp as a whip crack, sliced through the air before the elderly gentleman even realized they were meant for him. Justice Harold Carter, though no one there yet knew his name, froze mid-step beside his dark gray sedan. He had just returned from a long day at the courthouse and had stopped at a tiny corner grocery to pick up chamomile tea for his wife, who was feeling under the weather. Now, the quiet errand he'd done 1,000 times before had turned into a nightmare. Blue and red lights pulsed against the shop's windows, painting his dignified gray suit in streaks of chaos. The street, which moment ago hummed softly with the distant buzz of street lamps and the rattle of a vending cart, fell silent except for the wail of the police cruiser's siren winding down. Harold's instincts, as both a black man who had grown up during the Civil Rights era and as a seasoned Supreme Court justice, told him not to make any sudden movements. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his trembling hands until they hovered at shoulder height, palms open, fingers spread wide. His gold wedding band caught the flashing lights and sparkled, a quiet reminder of the life waiting for him back home. From the cruiser's driver's side door leapt a young police officer, no older than 27, his uniform crisp, his gun drawn and pointed squarely at Harold's chest. The officer's face was tight, jaw clenched, eyes narrowed, not with calm authority, but with a nervous tension that made the barrel of his pistol quiver slightly. Step away from the car. Now! He barked again, advancing a few steps. Harold's voice, though shaky, came out low and measured, the tone of a man used commanding a courtroom. Officer, I don't understand. I haven't done anything wrong. Keep your mouth shut and do what I say, the cop snapped. The words were harsh enough to make a couple of pedestrians across the street glance over. A gust of cool evening air swept through, rustling Harold's neatly pressed suit jacket. He felt his heartbeat thud against his ribs, but his face remained calm. For decades he had handled some of the most high-profile cases in the nation. He had faced lawyers shouting, media storms, even death threats. Yet nothing prepared him for the sting of having a weapon aimed at him simply because of who he appeared to be at that moment. An older black man standing near a car. His mind raced through the steps he had lectured young attorneys about in law school seminars. Stay calm, comply, don't escalate. He cleared his throat carefully. Sir, if you'd allow me, I can explain. Don't you move. Hands stay where they are. The officer barked again, stepping closer, his boots striking the pavement with sharp, deliberate thuds. The small late-night grocery door creaked open behind Harold as a cashier. A teenager with earbuds dangling from his hoodie peeked out, wide-eyed. Farther down the block, a couple who had been walking their dog slowed to a stop, the leash tightening as they took in the sight of the gun drawn at an elderly man in a suit. One of them pulled out a phone, its small red recording light winking in the dark. Harold stood still, remembering his father's words decades ago. Son, sometimes the wisest thing a black man can do is to stay still enough to keep breathing. The officer's flashlight beam darted over the sedan's plates, then back up to Harold's face, but his stance remained rigid, weapon still aimed. Turn around. Face the car, he shouted. Slowly, Harold obeyed, his hand still high. As he pivoted, the street lamp caught the edges of his silver hair. The wind stirred again, carried with it the distant honk of a taxi and the faint hum of a bus turning a corner, mundane city noises that somehow made the scene feel even more surreal. He could feel the stares of the gathering bystanders. He knew what they were seeing. An old man, distinguished but vulnerable, caught in the merciless glow of patrol car lights, standing perfectly still like a statue carved out of dignity and fear. Officer, he said finally, in a voice that was calm yet edged with quiet steel, My wallet is in my inside pocket. I'd like to show you my identification, so you'll know I'm not who you think I am." "Not a chance," the officer barked. "Keep your hands right where I can see them. I don't trust you." A murmur rippled through the small crowd, now forming at a safe distance. Someone whispered, "He looks harmless. Why's he got a gun on him?" Another voice said, "Man's in a suit. This don't look right." The red and blue lights kept flashing, throwing shadows across Harold's lined face. Every flicker of light revealed the deep creases at the corners of his eyes, evidence of decades spent reading law books late into the night, of years fighting for justice in courtrooms where every word mattered. Tonight, though, those years seemed invisible to the man pointing the gun. In those tense minutes, Harold's thoughts wandered briefly to his wife waiting at home with her teacup, perhaps glancing at the clock and wondering what was taking him so long. He pictured the bookshelf in his study lined with decades of legal journals, the framed photo of him shaking hands with two presidents, the plaques commemorating his work for equality, all of it meaningless out here beneath flashing sirens. His arm began to ache from holding them raised for so long, but he didn't dare lower them even an inch. Instead, he steadied his breathing, silently counting each inhale and exhale the way he did before delivering important verdicts. From somewhere in the back of his mind, he could hear a lesson he'd often told young clerks. The power of law is nothing without patience and restraint. If you lose your calm, you lose your case. That thought became his anchor now. Keep his fear at bay as the officer inched closer, knuckles white around the pistol grip. The moment stretched, heavy and electric, as if the whole street were holding its breath. And that was when another voice in the crowd finally cut through the tension, though the words and the ripple they caused would come later in the story, only minutes before Officer Miller had confronted Justice Carter. The police radio had crackled to life with an urgent call. Unit 12, possible car theft near Green Market on 8th and Pine. Suspect described as a tall black male, approximately late 50s to early 60s, wearing dark clothes, driving a dark-colored four-door sedan. Suspect may still be in the area. That was all the information Miller got, an incomplete, vague description that could have fit hundreds of people in the city. He had been patrolling alone for the evening shift, and when that call came through, adrenaline shot through him like a surge of caffeine. Miller was new to the force, barely 18 months in uniform. He was ambitious, eager to prove himself to his sergeant, to the veterans in the precinct, and even to his father, a retired cop who often reminded him, "Real cops don't hesitate. They act." That voice echoed in his head now as he gripped the steering wheel and scanned every passing car. The night streets shimmered with scattered rain puddles, reflecting the streetlights. Traffic was light. Somewhere out there, Miller imagined, was a dangerous thief ready to run. He told himself he'd be the one to stop him. This would be the arrest that proved he wasn't just a rookie everyone teased at roll call. A few blocks in the reported area, Miller spotted a dark gray sedan pulling over by the curb near a small grocery. The driver stepped out, an older black man in a tailored gray suit. In Miller's hyper-focused state, every detail suddenly felt suspicious. The man's height matched, his car color matched. Even the way he glanced around before walking toward the store felt, at least Miller, like someone checking if they were being followed. His heart thudded. He barely noticed the government license plates glinting under the street lamp. Instead, the radio description echoed in his head like a drumbeat. Tall black male, dark sedan still in the area. "Gotcha," Miller muttered under his breath, flicking on his cruiser's lights. He didn't call for backup. He didn't double-check the plates through the computer. His pulse drowned out reason. The rookie inside him wanted this bust all to himself. Inside the grocery store, Justice Carter was calmly paying for a small box of tea and a loaf of bread. Outside, Miller parked diagonally behind Carter's sedan, headlights glaring, and stepped out with his hand already resting on his holster. He thought of the stories from academy instructors about suspects pulling weapons during routine stops. He thought of his father's warning, "Hesitate and you could be the one going home in a body bag." Those thoughts hardened his resolve. So by the time Carter opened his car door, Miller's gun was already drawn. "Get your hands up, old man," he barked, his voice louder than he intended. His tone startled even himself, but he refused to lower it. He believed a show of dominance would keep the situation under control. Carter's slow, cautious movements only fed Miller's suspicion. Why was the guy so calm? Why wasn't he panicking like guilty people usually did? In Miller's young mind, that composure looked almost too practiced, like a man hiding something. Pedestrians on the sidewalk began to glance over at the flashing lights. Miller felt the weight of their stares, mistaking their concern for admiration. They're about to see me take down a car thief, he thought. He squared his shoulders and barked another command. Step away from the car. Do not reach for anything. Carter complied without argument, his eyes fixed steadily on the officer's face. His calmness unsettled Miller even more. As Miller inched closer, he noticed a man's hands tremble slightly under the lights. For a split second, a pang of doubt crossed his mind. Maybe he was just an ordinary guy. But then the radio call replayed again in his memory, fueling his adrenaline. Tall black male, late 50s, sedan. He convinced himself that hesitation could be dangerous. His finger rested along the side of the trigger guard, close enough to fire if anything went wrong. Meanwhile, Carter's thoughts were racing in a completely different direction. He wondered if the officer was simply nervous or if something worse was at play, an assumption drawn from the color of his skin. As a judge, he had seen cases like this in court, traffic stops that spiraled into tragedies. Now he was living one. Officer, Carter said gently, I'm reaching for my wallet, slowly, to show you my ID. Don't you dare. Miller snapped, stepping closer, chest puffed out like a soldier bracing for combat. You fit the description of a suspect wanted for car theft. Don't lie to me. Those words cut Carter deeper than the weapon pointed at him. He had spent decades defending the Constitution, yet here he was, presumed guilty on sight. The crowd outside the store began murmuring louder. Phones raised a record. A man in a baseball cap muttered, This ain't right. He looks like somebody's grandpa. A woman whispered, Why's he got a gun on an old man? The tension hung heavy in the air. Carter shifted slightly to ease the stiffness in his back, and Miller flinched, yelling, Freeze! That startled Carter. And for the first time, he felt a flicker of real fear that the situation might explode in an instant. At that moment, Miller's sergeant radioed in, asking for a status update. Miller hesitated before answering, not wanting to admit he hadn't confirmed the suspect's identity yet. He gave a vague reply, still investigating the scene, and kept his weapon raised. What Miller didn't know was that the actual suspect had already been caught 3 blocks away moments before. Dispatch had just started typing up the notice, but it hadn't been transmitted to his unit yet. He was threatening an innocent man who not only wasn't a criminal, but was one of the country's most respected legal minds. The crowd's murmurs grew louder. A teenager muttered, Somebody better step in before this goes south. The phone cameras kept rolling. Through it all, Carter stayed still, his face calm, but inside his heart pounded. He thought about how ironic it was. How many times he had sat in a courtroom warning officers about implicit bias, about the danger of snap judgments. Now he was the victim of one. The grocery cashier peeked out again from the doorway, uncertain whether to intervene or call someone. A passing cab slowed down, the driver craning his neck at the surreal scene. And all the while, Miller's thoughts churned. If this guy makes a move, it's on me to stop him. If I let him go and he really is the thief, I'll look like a fool. His training told him to de-escalate, but his pride, his fear, and the vague suspect description told him to hold his ground. The 2 men stood locked in that tense standoff, one demanding obedience, the other offering calm compliance, each shaped by experiences the other couldn't fully understand. The street outside the little grocery was no longer quiet. By now, the flashing lights had drawn a small crowd, half a dozen people at first, then more trickling in as curious pedestrians stopped to watch. Some stood silently with arms crossed. Others whispered, shaking their heads at the sight of a young officer pointing a gun at a frail, gray-haired man in a neat suit. Phones glowed like tiny lanterns in the dark, as almost everyone began recording. Just as Harold Carter remained still, his hands high, every muscle taut from the strain of keeping them raised. In his peripheral vision, he saw movement. A slim young woman weaving through the crowd, phone in hand, her expression tense and focused. That woman was Maya Hernandez, a third-year law student at the local university. She had been walking home from the library, earbuds in, until the sirens and Ray's voices made her pull them out. When she spotted a man under the police spotlight, her heart lurched. "No way, that's Justice Carter," she murmured to herself. She'd met him once at a guest lecture on constitutional law. She remembered the warmth in his smile, the way he'd stayed after the talk to answer questions for students like her. And now here he was, hands in the air like a suspect. Maya's stomach knotted. She hit record on her phone, pushing through the crowd until she was at the front. "Officer," she called out, her voice clear and steady despite her racing heart. "Officer, that's Justice Harold Carter. He's a Supreme Court judge." For a split second, the words seemed to hang frozen in the night air. A few bystanders gasped. Someone whispered, "Did she say Supreme Court judge?" Officer Miller's grip on his pistol faltered only slightly, but his eyes flicked toward Maya. "Back off, ma'am," he ordered, trying to sound authoritative even as a wave of doubt rippled through him. "This is an active police matter. Don't interfere." Maya didn't flinch. "You're making a mistake," she said, taking a cautious step closer but keeping her tone respectful. "This man has dedicated his entire life to upholding the law. Look at his license plates. They're official government plates. You can see the emblem right there." Several people in the crowd craned their necks to see the plates. Indeed, the emblem glinted under the streetlight, but Miller kept his eyes fixed on Carter. He felt trapped between his own rising uncertainty and the pressure of all the phones recording his every move. A man in the crowd, middle-aged, wearing a delivery driver's jacket, spoke up next. "Come on, officer. You can't just keep a gun on somebody without checking his ID first. Let him show you who he is." Others chimed in. "Yeah, check his ID." "Don't shoot him, he's not resisting." The atmosphere shifted from nervous curiosity to simmering indignation. The crowd's voices grew louder, echoing off the brick storefronts. Cars slowed as drivers rolled down windows to stare at the scene. Justice Carter stayed silent, letting the voices around him build. He didn't want to escalate things further. His priority was to stay alive and keep the officer calm. But inwardly, he felt a surge of gratitude for Maya's courage. Miller's thoughts were spinning. He'd started the stop full of confidence. But now, under the judgmental glare of dozens of strangers and the threat of going viral for the wrong reasons, his certainty cracked. What if he really had made a terrible mistake? But what if he lowered his guard and the man actually was dangerous? His training told him not to let bystanders dictate his actions, yet the crowd shouts drilled holes in his resolve. "Sir." Maya tried again, her voice firmer now. "Please, just let him take out his wallet slowly. I can vouch for him. He spoke at my university last month about equal justice. He's exactly who I say he is." The name, Justice Carter, began to ripple through the onlookers. "Justice Carter? For real?" a teenager whispered, pulling up his phone's browser to search the name. Within seconds, he turned the screen toward the others, an image of Carter in his black judicial robe, smiling beside a U.S. flag. "See? That's him," the teen exclaimed. Miller's jaw tightened. The evidence of who the man was grew harder to ignore, but the rookie in him still clung to procedure. "I have to control the scene. I can't let the crowd sway me." He barked to the bystanders. "Everyone stay back." I said back. But the command no longer carried the same authority as before. The crowd didn't surge forward, but neither did they retreat. Their collective disapproval filled the air like an invisible wall pressing in on the officer. A woman holding her phone muttered just loud enough for others to hear, "This is exactly why people don't trust the police anymore." Another added, "Imagine humiliating a judge like this. He's probably done more for justice than that kid ever will." Carter noticed Miller's hands trembling slightly on the pistol grip now. He recognized the signs of a young man in over his head, teetering between authority and panic. He spoke gently, aiming his words to pierce that tension. "Officer," Carter said in his calm, courtroom-steady tone, "I understand you have a job to do. I respect that. But I assure you, I am not your suspect. You can resolve this right now by simply allowing me to hand over my identification." For a brief moment, their eyes met. Miller saw not fear or defiance, but a steady patience in the older man's gaze, an almost fatherly composure that clashed with every suspicion he'd held. Before Miller could respond, the wail of another siren approached. A second squad car slid to a stop, and Sergeant Daniel stepped out, surveying the scene with a frown. He was a seasoned officer with 25 years on the force, the kind who could sense trouble from a block away. "What's going on here, Miller?" Daniels barked, striding toward them. "Why is your weapon still drawn?" Miller stiffened. "Possible suspect for the car theft on 8th and Pine, sir. Matches the description." Daniel's eyes shifted to Carter, and instantly recognition dawned. "Good Lord, that's Justice Carter." The sergeant's tone changed instantly from stern to urgent. "Miller, holster your weapon. Now!" The command rang through the air with the weight of authority Miller's voice had lacked. The rookie's face went pale. He fumbled slightly as he lowered the gun, sliding it back into the holster, his pulse hammering louder than the crowd's murmurs. The crowd exhaled collectively, an audible release of tension. Maya lowered her phone slightly but kept recording, wanting the moment documented. Daniel stepped up to Carter, his voice respectful but lined with regret. "Justice Carter, sir, I'm so sorry about this. We'll straighten it out immediately." Carter gave a polite nod, his hand still raised. "Thank you, Sergeant. I'd appreciate putting my arms down now." "Of course, sir. Please," Daniel said quickly, motioning for him to relax. Carter slowly lowered his arms, rolling his shoulders to ease the stiffness. The weight of that simple gesture, finally being allowed to rest his hands, seemed to settle over the entire scene. Miller stood a few steps behind his sergeant, his face red with embarrassment. He couldn't meet Carter's eyes or the crowd's accusing stares. He suddenly felt exposed, as if every phone lens was magnifying his every flaw. The crowd's attitude shifted from outrage to murmurs of disbelief. "Wow, he really is a judge. That poor man. Imagine going through that after all he's done for the country." The flashing red and blue lights were finally turned off, leaving the street bathed once more in the soft yellow of street lamps. The tension in the air began to thin, but the weight of what just happened lingered heavily, like the smell of smoke after a fire. Sergeant Daniel stepped closer to Justice Harold Carter with a look of deep regret. "Sir," he said quietly, "I cannot tell you how sorry I am for this. Officer Miller overstepped. We'll handle it." Carter straightened his shoulders, his gray suit slightly rumpled from the ordeal. His calm eyes met the sergeant's. "I appreciate your intervention, Sergeant," he said, his tone composed. "But what concerns me more than my own humiliation is the reason it happened in the first place." Daniel shifted uneasily, glancing toward Miller, who stood a few feet away looking like a chastened schoolboy, his hands clasped tightly behind his back, his face pale. Carter turned to face the young officer. "Son," he began, his voice deep yet gentle, carrying the authority of decades on the bench, "do you know what fear does when you mix it with prejudice? It blinds you." Miller's lips parted slightly as though to respond, but no words came out. Carter continued, taking a slow step closer, so that his words were meant for Miller, but carried loudly enough for the crowd to hear. "Tonight, that fear nearly cost you more than your job. It could have cost a life, mine or yours." The officer swallowed hard, shifting his weight awkwardly. His usual confidence had been stripped away. In its place was a raw, almost childlike guilt. I'm sorry, sir," Miller stammered finally, his voice cracking. "I didn't know who you were. I thought—" "That's the problem," Carter interrupted, his tone still calm but firmer now. "You didn't want to know. You saw what you expected to see, not what was in front of you. That's how injustice begins, one assumption at a time." The bystanders who had stayed behind to witness the resolution fell silent, hanging on every word. Even Sergeant Daniels lowered his head slightly, as though the words were meant for every uniform standing there. Miller took a shaky breath. I was trying to do my job. I thought I was protecting people." Carter's stern expression softened just a fraction. "I believe you," he said quietly. "I believe that you thought you were doing the right thing. But the law isn't just about instincts and fear. It's about reason, fairness, and restraint. If we abandon those, we lose the very justice we claim to protect. The words landed heavily on Miller, who lowered his gaze to the ground. The rookie's mind replayed the moment he'd drawn his gun, the rush of adrenaline, the certainty that he was being decisive. Now, all he could feel was the weight of how close he had come to making a tragic mistake. Carter studied the young man's face for a moment longer. "Tell me, officer," he said, "what made you point a gun at an elderly man in a suit without first checking his license plate or asking a single question?" Miller hesitated before answering. The description on the radio, it said tall black male, dark sedan. I thought I had to act fast. Carter's brow furrowed slightly. Acting fast isn't the same as acting justly. A vague description isn't a license to treat every black man as a suspect. You let that description and your assumptions do the thinking for you. The crowd murmured in agreement. Maya, who was still standing nearby, crossed her arms and nodded quietly, clearly moved by Carter's words. Miller tried to respond but stopped himself, realizing there was no defense that could undo what had happened. Carter sighed softly, as though the weight of decades of similar injustices rested on his shoulders. He took a step back and spoke in a more reflective tone. "You know, I've sat on the bench for more years than you've been alive. I've ruled on cases where a single rash decision ruined lives. Fear is powerful, but so is wisdom. I hope tonight teaches you the difference between the two." Miller finally raised his eyes, his voice low but sincere. "I never wanted to hurt anyone. I didn't think. I'm truly sorry, sir." Something in his voice, genuine remorse, the rawness of a young man realizing his own flaws, softened Carter further. "You're young," Carter said. "You still have time to learn. But you must promise yourself to do better, because next time, the person in front of you might not survive your mistake." A long silence followed. The street, now mostly clear of onlookers, felt almost sacred in that moment, a place where a lesson had been carved into the heart of a young man. Sergeant Daniels cleared his throat. "Justice Carter, I'll personally file a report about this and make sure the department takes proper action. I can't excuse what happened, but I'll ensure it doesn't get brushed aside." Carter nodded appreciatively. "Thank you, Sergeant. I trust you'll see to it that the right lessons are learned." Maya stepped forward tentatively, addressing Carter. "Sir, I hope you know people saw how you handled this. You didn't shout or panic. You stayed calm even when it wasn't fair. That taught us all something, too." A faint smile curved Carter's lips. "Sometimes calmness is the only weapon we have," he replied. He turned back to Miller one last time. "Humility isn't a weakness, Officer Miller. Tonight you've been humbled. Don't waste that lesson. Let it guide you to be the kind of officer who sees the person, not just a profile." Miller nodded slowly, his throat tight, barely managing to whisper, "Yes, sir." The exchange felt less like a lecture and more like a moment of transformation. Miller wasn't the only one changed. The onlookers, Maya, even Sergeant Daniels carried away the weight of what they'd just witnessed. A rare moment when authority met grace and grace didn't flinch. As the last of the crowd dispersed, Carter finally retrieved his small bag from the grocery store, just a box of chamomile tea and bread for his wife, and headed toward his car. He paused before opening the door and looked back at the young officer. "Remember this night," he said quietly. "Not for what you did wrong, but for what you could do right from here on." Miller stood frozen, nodding silently as Carter drove away. The young officer felt that those parting words were more powerful than any reprimand he'd ever received from his superiors. They weren't just words, they were a second chance. The following morning, the city woke to a headline that spread like wildfire. "Rookie cop points gun at elderly black man, who turns out to be Supreme Court judge." The news broke across every major channel, radio station, and social media feed. A grainy cell phone video, recorded by one of the bystanders that night, went viral within hours. In the video, viewers could see the moment Officer Miller raised his weapon and the calm, unwavering composure of Justice Harold Carter as he stood tall under the threat of that gun. What captivated the public most wasn't just the injustice, it was the way Carter handled it. No yelling, no anger, just steady words that carried the weight of wisdom and dignity. By noon, hashtags like #JusticeCarter and #Humility in Uniform were trending nationwide. News anchors replayed the footage over and over, analyzing every detail. Talk shows invited civil rights activists, retired judges, and former police chiefs to discuss the incident. And in every conversation, one thing became clear. Carter's composure had turned what could have been another tragedy into a powerful lesson for the nation. At the precinct, Officer Miller sat alone in the break room, staring at the untouched cup of coffee in front of him. The usually noisy space felt unbearably quiet. His badge lay on the table, next to a printed copy of the morning's headline. Everywhere he went that day, on his phone, on TV in the background, he saw his own face. The shame of what he'd done gnawed at him. When Sergeant Daniels walked in, Miller didn't look up. "I ruined everything," he muttered. Daniels placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "You made a mistake," he said, "but the real test is what you do after it. You got a chance to make things right. Most people don't get that chance after a night like this." Miller let out a shaky breath. "I keep thinking, I could have pulled that trigger. I could have." He stopped himself, unable to finish the thought. Daniels nodded solemnly. "But you didn't. And now you need to learn, listen, and prove that you can be better. Carter gave you that chance. Don't waste it." Meanwhile, Justice Carter sat in his home office, surrounded by shelves of well-worn law books and framed photos of his decades of service. The events of the night before still played in his mind like a silent film. His wife, Lillian, brought him a cup of tea, the same chamomile tea he'd gone out to buy. "You handled yourself with such grace, Harold," she said softly, sitting beside him. "But I know you. This isn't the first time you've been judged before you were heard." Carter sighed, staring into the steam rising from his tea. "No, it isn't," he said quietly. "But I'd hoped it wouldn't happen again. Not at this stage of my life. Not after everything we've fought for." Lillian touched his hand gently. "Maybe last night wasn't just for you. Maybe it was for that young officer to learn. Maybe it was for everyone watching." Carter nodded slowly. "Perhaps. Sometimes the law teaches best outside the courtroom." 2 days later, the city organized a public forum at a local community center. The goal was to open dialogue between the police and the people they served. To everyone's surprise, Justice Carter agreed to attend. And so did Officer Miller. The room was packed. Reporters, local residents, college students, fellow officers. The air buzzed with tension and curiosity as Carter took his place on stage, standing tall behind a simple wooden podium. When the moderator introduced him, the audience erupted in applause. Carter raised a hand gently to quiet them before speaking. "I stand before you tonight," he began, his voice steady and resonant. "Not as a victim, but as a man who believes in the power of justice, even when it fails us." The room fell completely silent. He continued, "What happened on that street was not just about me or about one young officer. It was about something deeper, the danger of judging others before we know them, the cost of fear, and the urgent need to rebuild trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve." He spoke about his decades on the bench, about the many times he'd seen fear and bias lead to tragedy. But he also spoke about forgiveness, about the power of growth and humility. When it was Miller's turn to speak, the young officer walked to the podium slowly, visibly nervous. He looked out at the crowd, at the skeptical faces, the cameras flashing, and took a deep breath. "I can't change what I did that night," he began, his voice low but sincere. "I let my fear guide me instead of my training, instead of my humanity. I'm sorry, not just to Justice Carter, but to everyone who's ever been treated like they were guilty before they were even spoken to." A ripple of murmurs moved through the crowd. Some looked unconvinced. Others softened at the vulnerability in his words. Miller continued, "Justice Carter could have demanded my suspension. He could have asked for my badge. Instead, he taught me something I'll never forget: humility. I promise to carry that lesson into every call I answer from this day forward." By the time he stepped down, the room was quiet again, but this time it wasn't from tension. It was from the weight of what had been said. That night, clips from the forum went viral too. One in particular, a moment where Carter placed a reassuring hand on Miller's shoulder, captured the hearts of millions online. People began sharing it with captions like, "This is how change starts," and "Grace under pressure." A week later, the city announced new training programs for officers focused on empathy, de-escalation, and implicit bias awareness. Justice Carter was invited to consult on the curriculum. The incident that had started as yet another story of racial profiling became something more, a spark for genuine reform. 1 month later, Carter returned to the courthouse for a special hearing. Outside, reporters waited, hoping for a quote. "Justice Carter," one journalist asked, "do you forgive Officer Miller for what happened that night?" Carter paused, his gaze thoughtful, then replied, "Forgiveness is not about forgetting. It's about choosing to move forward so that both sides can grow. I forgave him the moment I saw that he was willing to learn." The quote made the front page the next day. For Officer Miller, life at the precinct wasn't easy after that. There were whispers, sideways glances, even a few colleagues who mocked his public apology. But over time, he started to win back respect, not by arguing, but by showing up differently on every call, by listening more, by treating every citizen as though they mattered. Months later, Miller would quietly tell a colleague that night had changed the way he saw the badge, not as a weapon of authority, but as a duty to protect with compassion. As for Justice Carter, he went back to his quiet routines. Long days at the courthouse, peaceful evenings at home with Lillian and their chamomile tea. But something had shifted in the city. Neighbors still stopped him at the grocery store to thank him for his dignity that night. Strangers sent letters, some sharing their own stories of being judged unfairly. Others saying the video gave them hope that kindness could still exist in the face of hate. Carter often replied to those letters personally, writing in his elegant cursive, "Justice begins in the heart. The law only follows where the heart leads."